Picture yourself standing at the edge of a Malaysian village as twilight surrenders to darkness. The air hangs thick and heavy, saturated with the scent of tropical flowers and the distant promise of rain. This is not the comfortable darkness of your bedroom or the predictable shadows of a city street. This is the darkness that remembers, that breathes, that watches. In this place, where the modern world has not yet fully erased the old, the boundary between what we know and what we fear remains as fragile as spider silk stretched across a doorway. Welcome to a realm where the night does not simply fall, but descends with purpose, carrying with it stories that have survived centuries, precisely because they refuse to be forgotten. If you have found your way here, to this channel, to this moment, then you are searching for something beyond the ordinary. You are ready to peer into the shadows that most turn away from, to understand the truths that folklore preserves, like amber trapping ancient life. This is Echoes of the Old World, where we do not simply tell stories, but resurrect them, examining the bones of belief that have shaped entire cultures. If you are prepared to journey with me into these forgotten corners of human experience, I invite you to subscribe now. Together, we will explore the creatures that haunt not just our imaginations, but our collective memory, the entities that represent our deepest fears given form and name. Before we descend deeper into tonight's darkness, I want to know something about you. Leave a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from right now. Are you in a brightly lit room, or have you dimmed the lights? Are you alone, or is someone sitting beside you, unaware of the story about to unfold? Your presence here, wherever you are, connects you to a tradition of storytelling that spans continents and centuries, and I am genuinely curious to know how far these echoes reach. Now let us turn our attention to Southeast Asia, to the tropical heartland of Malaysia, where the jungle presses close to human habitation and the night arrives not gradually, but suddenly, like a curtain dropping. In this region, bounded by ancient rainforests and crossed by rivers that have witnessed millennia of human history, there exists a legend so viscerally disturbing, so profoundly unsettling, that it has persisted through generations despite every rational attempt to dismiss it. This is not a ghost story in the Western sense, not a pale spectre wandering castle corridors, or a transparent figure glimpsing through windows. This is something far more primal, far more physically impossible, and therefore far more terrifying. This is the legend of the Penanggalan, and she represents a category of supernatural entity that challenges our very understanding of what it means to be human. The word itself carries weight in the Malay language, derived from the root that means to detach or to remove. But what is being detached, you might ask? Not a limb or an appendage, not something that could be reattached or healed. No, the Penanggalan is defined by a separation so complete, so fundamentally wrong, that it exists at the intersection of biology and nightmare. She is, at her core, the manifestation of transformation gone catastrophically awry, a woman who through her own actions or through curse has become something that should not exist, according to any natural law. Understand that Malaysia's folklore is not a collection of quaint fairy tales meant to entertain children around cooking fires. It is a sophisticated system of belief that served practical purposes for communities living in close proximity to danger, both natural and supernatural. The jungle at night is genuinely perilous, filled with venomous snakes, wild predators, and terrain that can swallow the unwary. The rivers harbour crocodiles. Disease spreads through villages with devastating speed. In such an environment, folklore becomes a survival mechanism, encoding warnings and wisdom into memorable narratives. The Penanggalan is not simply a monster, but a personification of specific fears that women in traditional societies faced, dangers that were both mundane and metaphysical. Consider the village at night, when families have withdrawn into their homes and the only light comes from oil lamps flickering behind wooden walls. The darkness outside is absolute, punctuated only by the calls of nocturnal creatures and the rustle of wind through palm fronds. It is in these hours between midnight and dawn that the Penanggalan is said to emerge, transformed by forces that blur the line between magic and madness. She is female, which is crucial to understanding this legend, because the Penanggalan represents anxieties specific to feminine power, to the potential for women to access forces beyond male control or comprehension. The communities that believed in her, that took precautions against her, were not primitive or ignorant. They were sophisticated societies with complex social structures, trade networks that stretched across oceans, and artistic traditions of remarkable refinement. Yet, they also understood something that modern rationalism sometimes forgets: that fear serves a purpose, that the stories we tell in the dark prepare us for dangers, both literal and symbolic. The Penanggalan became a way to discuss topics that were otherwise difficult to address directly: matters of female agency, the dangers of childbirth, the vulnerability of new life, and the power that comes from forbidden knowledge. As we begin this exploration, I want you to release your modern skepticism, not permanently, but temporarily. Do not ask yourself whether the Penanggalan is real in the way a tiger or a storm is real. Instead, ask yourself what made generations of people believe she was real, what made mothers check their windows at night and midwives take specific precautions during births. Ask yourself what truth about human experience this impossible creature manages to capture and preserve. The folklore of any culture is never merely entertainment. It is a coded message from the past, a warning, a map of fears and values, a mirror held up to show us what a society considered most precious and most threatened. The Penanggalan exists in that liminal space between human and other, between the living and something that defies natural death. She is cursed, but also empowered, victim, but also predator, once ordinary, but now extraordinary in the most horrifying sense. To understand her is to understand the thin membrane that separates civilization from chaos, the fragile boundary that keeps us human. And on certain nights, in certain places, when the conditions align just right, that membrane grows so thin that something can push through from the other side. This is where our journey truly begins, at the moment of transformation, at the instant when a woman becomes something else entirely. What follows will challenge your comfort, will make you question what you thought you knew about the limits of folklore and the of fear. But if you have made it this far, if you have chosen to stay, rather than retreat to safer, simpler stories, then you are ready. You are ready to meet the Penanggalan, to understand her origin, her and the terrible hunger that drives her through the darkness. You are ready to learn why, even now, in an age of electric lights and locked doors, her legend refuses to die. Every monster has a beginning, a moment when the ordinary becomes extraordinary, when the human crosses a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. The Penanggalan is no exception, though her origin is not one of innocent victimhood or cruel external curse imposed by jealous gods or vengeful spirits. No, the genesis of the Penanggalan is far more complex, far more troubling, because it speaks to human ambition, to the desperate pursuit of power, and to the catastrophic consequences of seeking knowledge that was never meant to be possessed. This is a cautionary tale as old as magic itself, a story about what happens when the practitioner loses control of forces she believed she had mastered. In the traditional telling, passed down through generations in Malaysian villages, the woman who becomes the Penanggalan begins as someone unremarkable yet ambitious. She is not born a monster, but chooses a path that will transform her into one. She is drawn to the practice of dark magic, to rituals and incantations that promise power beyond the ordinary limitations of human existence. Perhaps she seeks to extend her life, to maintain youth and beauty as the years threaten to steal them away. Perhaps she desires influence over others, the ability to bend wills and shape destinies. Or perhaps she simply craves knowledge of the hidden world, the secrets that lie just beyond the veil of normal perception. Whatever her motivation, she commits herself to a practice that requires sacrifice, dedication, and a willingness to transgress boundaries that society has established for good reason. The ritual itself is specific and demanding, requiring precise timing, exact ingredients, and most critically, absolute privacy and concentration. The practitioner must seclude herself, often in a location away from the village, a place where she will not be disturbed or discovered. She prepares a large vessel, traditionally described as a vat or barrel, and fills it with vinegar, a substance that will become central to her existence in ways she cannot yet imagine. The purpose of this initial immersion is purification and transformation, a chemical and spiritual alteration of her physical form that will prepare her for the power she seeks to claim. She must submerge herself completely in this vinegar bath while reciting specific incantations, calling upon forces that exist outside the normal order of reality. But here is where the tragedy, or perhaps the justice, unfolds. The ritual demands absolute completion without interruption. It is a process that, once begun, cannot be paused or abandoned. The practitioner must remain submerged, must complete every word of every incantation, must see the transformation through to its intended conclusion. Any break in concentration, any disturbance from the outside world, any moment of doubt or fear that causes her to stop before the ritual is properly finished will result in catastrophe. The magic will not simply fail or dissipate harmlessly. Instead, it will twist, corrupt, transform in ways that turn the practitioner herself into something monstrous, something trapped between successful transformation and utter failure. Imagine now the moment of interruption. Perhaps a family member grows concerned about her absence and comes searching. Perhaps a neighbor notices strange lights or sounds emanating from her secluded location and investigates. Perhaps a child wanders too close, drawn by curiosity. Or perhaps the practitioner herself, overwhelmed by the intensity of the experience, by sensations beyond anything human flesh was meant to endure, panics and emerges from the vinegar before the prescribed time has elapsed. The exact cause of interruption varies in different retellings, but the result is always the same, always horrifying, always irreversible. At the moment of disruption, the magic that was meant to grant her power instead rips her apart, but not in the way you might expect. There is no explosion of force, no visible destruction. Instead, something far more subtle and far more terrible occurs. The transformation that was supposed to grant her abilities beyond normal human limitations becomes literal in the most nightmarish way possible. The separation between body and mind, between physical form and consciousness, becomes not metaphorical, but actual. Her head, the seat of her consciousness and will, detaches completely from her body, taking with it the internal essence that sustains life, the connections that should remain hidden within the protective shell of flesh and bone. This is the birth of the Penanggalan, the moment when a woman seeking power becomes instead a creature defined by her curse. She does not die, which would perhaps be merciful. She does not transform completely into something else, which might at least be final. Instead, she exists in a state of perpetual division, forever split between two forms, neither of which is complete or whole. By day, she appears normal, her head reunited with her body, living among others with her terrible secret hidden. But when night falls, when the sun releases its hold on the world and darkness claims dominion, the separation occurs again, compelled by the incomplete magic that now defines her existence. The curse carries with it a terrible hunger, an unnatural craving that was not part of her original, but has been imposed by the failed ritual. She needs sustenance, but not the ordinary food that nourishes human bodies. The magic that animates her separate form demands something specific, something that represents life in its most vulnerable and pure state. This hunger will drive her actions, will send her flying through the night in search of victims who cannot defend themselves, who represent everything she has lost by crossing the threshold from human to monster. The irony is profound and cruel. She sought power and received it, but at a cost that transforms the gift into a curse, the ambition into an eternal punishment and all. Understand that this origin story serves multiple purposes in the cultural context where it emerged. It functions as a warning against the pursuit of forbidden knowledge, a deterrent to women who might be tempted to step outside the prescribed boundaries of acceptable behavior. In traditional Malaysian society, as in many cultures, women who practiced magic or claimed special powers were viewed with suspicion and fear, seen as threats to the social order that kept communities stable and predictable. The Penang, a Tainantan legend reinforces the message that such pursuits lead not to empowerment, but to isolation, monstrosity, and eternal suffering. Yet the story also reveals something more nuanced, something that speaks to the complex position of women in societies where their agency was limited and their desires often suppressed. The woman who becomes the Penanggalan is not passive or victimized by external forces. She is active, ambitious, seeking something beyond the narrow confines of her prescribed role. Her transformation can be read as a punishment, yes, but also as a twisted reflection of female power exercised outside patriarchal control. She becomes literally separated from her body, able to move freely through the night, unbound by the physical limitations that constrain ordinary women. That this freedom comes at such a terrible cost, that it transforms her into a predator rather than liberating her, is the tragedy at the heart of the legend. The ritual gone wrong, the interrupted transformation, the incomplete magic that traps her between human and monster. These elements combine to create a creature that is both pitiable and terrifying. She is not evil but by necessity, driven by hungers she did not choose, trapped in a form she cannot escape. Every night, she must separate, must fly, must seek the sustenance that her cursed existence demands. And every dawn she must return, must reunite with her waiting body, must pretend to be human again, despite knowing that she has crossed a boundary that can never be uncrossed. This is the Penanggalan's origin, the moment when ambition met consequence, when power became curse, when a woman lost herself in the pursuit of something more and became something less than human in the process. There exists a moment each night when the Penanggalan must face what she has become, when the illusion of normalcy shatters and the true of her curse manifests in its full horror. This is not a gradual transformation like the slow shifting of a werewolf under the full moon, nor is it a violent explosion of supernatural energy. Instead, it is something quieter, more intimate, and far more deeply wrong. It is the moment of separation, the nightly division that defines her existence and marks the boundary between her human mask and her monstrous reality. To understand the Penanggalan, you must understand this process, must grasp the mechanics of what should be impossible, what violates every law of biology and reason. As darkness settles over the village and the last light fades from the western sky, the woman who carries this curse feels the change beginning. It starts as a pressure, a sensation deep within her chest and throat, as though something is pulling upward from inside her body. There is no pain, which perhaps makes it worse, because pain would at least confirm that this is a violation, an injury that the body recognizes as damage. Instead, there is only an inexorable compulsion, a magical imperative that cannot be resisted or delayed. She has learned through bitter experience that fighting this nightly transformation is futile, that attempting to suppress it only intensifies the sensation until it becomes unbearable. The curse will have its way, and resistance merely prolongs the inevitable. She retreats to a private space, somewhere she will not be observed, because the separation must occur in secrecy. The body that will remain behind must be hidden, protected, kept safe until dawn brings reunion and restoration. She might prepare a locked room, a concealed area beneath her home, or a secluded spot in the surrounding jungle where no one ventures after dark. This location becomes her sanctuary and her prison, the place where she leaves behind what remains of her humanity each night. The choice of hiding place is critical, because if her dormant form were discovered, if someone were to find the body lying motionless and seemingly lifeless, the consequences could be catastrophic for both her and the discoverer. The actual moment of detachment is described in the folklore with a specificity that suggests deep cultural knowledge of this legend, as though generations have contemplated the mechanics of this impossible act. The head does not tear away violently or rip free with force. Instead, it rises, lifted by the magic that animates it, separating cleanly at the base where head meets shoulders. What makes this particularly disturbing, what elevates it beyond simple decapitation, is that the head does not depart alone. It carries with it the internal essence of life, the connections that normally remain hidden within the protective cage of ribs and the sealed cavity of the body. These trailing elements, described in traditional accounts as resembling roots or tendrils, hang beneath the floating head, giving the Penanggalan her distinctive and nightmarish silhouette. What remains behind is the body, now empty and dormant, a shell that appears to be sleeping or perhaps dead to the casual observer. The chest does not rise and fall with breath, the heart does not beat with its familiar rhythm, yet the flesh does not cool or stiffen with true death. It exists in a state of suspended animation, preserved by the same magic that allows the separated head to fly and hunt. This body must be protected at all costs, because it is the anchor that allows the Penanggalan to return to human form when dawn approaches. Without it, she would be trapped forever in her separated state, unable to rest, unable to hide among normal humans, exposed and vulnerable in ways that would quickly lead to her destruction. The separated head, now free from its physical constraints, begins to exhibit capabilities that defy natural law. It rises into the air, achieving flight through means that have nothing to do with wings or aerodynamics, and everything to do with the supernatural force that animates it. The traditional descriptions speak of a faint, eerie glow that surrounds the head as it moves through darkness, a phosphorescence that might be the visible manifestation of the magic itself, or perhaps the life force that has been unnaturally extracted from the body. This glow is dim enough to blend with moonlight or shadow, bright enough to be glimpsed by unlucky witnesses who find themselves abroad after dark. As the Penanggalan takes to the air, she experiences a freedom that is simultaneously exhilarating and horrifying. She is no longer bound by gravity or the limitations of walking, no longer constrained by doors or walls, or the need to follow paths and roads. She can rise above the village, can move silently between houses, can peer into windows and slip through openings too small for a full human body to navigate. This mobility is part of what makes her so feared, because it renders traditional barriers meaningless. A locked door, a barred window, a high wall, none of these obstacles can stop something that flies and has no body to impede its passage through narrow gaps. Yet this freedom comes with profound vulnerability. The separated head, despite its supernatural abilities, is fragile in ways that a complete body is not. It has no limbs to defend itself if cornered, no strength beyond its flight and its frightening appearance. If discovered in this form, if someone were to attack it with iron implements or blessed weapons, the Penanggalan would be unable to flee quickly or fight back effectively. More critically, she is bound to her body by an invisible tether, a magical connection that grows more urgent as the night progresses. She cannot travel unlimited distances or stay away indefinitely. She must always remain aware of where her body lies hidden, must always plan her hunting route to allow time for return before the sun rises. The separation also brings with it the hunger that defines her nocturnal activities. This craving is not present during the day, when she exists in her complete human form. It only manifests when head and body divide, as though the very act of separation creates a void that demands filling. This hunger is specific and terrible, driving her to seek victims who represent life in its most vulnerable state, targets who cannot defend themselves and whose essence carries particular power in the supernatural logic of her curse. We will explore this hunger and its implications in depth shortly, but understand that it is intrinsic to the separation itself, an unavoidable consequence of existing in this divided state. The psychological impact of this nightly division cannot be overstated. Imagine what it does to one's sense of self to be literally split apart each night, to experience your consciousness separated from the physical form that normally contains it. The Penanggalan retains her human mind, her memories, her personality, yet she must function in a form that is fundamentally inhuman. She sees the world from a perspective that no natural creature possesses, floating through darkness with trailing essence beneath her. She must reconcile the woman she was, perhaps still is during daylight hours, with the predator she becomes when night falls and the separation occurs. This division also affects how others in her community perceive her. Though they may not know the truth of what she is, there are subtle signs that might alert the observant, changes in behavior that arise from living this double existence. She may seem tired during the day, drained by her nocturnal activities. She might avoid certain social obligations that would require her presence after dark. She develops habits around protecting her privacy, ensuring that no one can discover her secret hiding place or witness the moment of transformation. These patterns, while not proof of her, can create suspicion, particularly in communities where belief in the Penanggalan is deeply rooted and vigilance is seen as necessary for survival. The separation defines the Penanggalan's existence, marking her as neither fully human nor entirely supernatural creature. She is caught between two states, forced to oscillate between them with each cycle of day and night. This endless repetition, this inability to remain whole and complete, is perhaps the cruelest aspect of her curse. She can never escape what she has become, never remain purely one thing or the other. The moment of separation arrives with inexorable certainty each night, and with it comes the hunger, the flight, the terrible necessity of feeding that drives her into the darkness in search of her next victim. To understand the terror that the Penanggalan inspires, you must confront the image itself. the specific visual horror that has been seared into Malaysian cultural consciousness for centuries. This is not a creature whose power lies in ambiguity or in what remains unseen. No, the Penanggalan's horror is visceral and immediate, a violation of every expectation about what a human form should be and how a living thing should exist. She is defined by what should be impossible, by a configuration of existence that challenges the most basic assumptions about anatomy and life. To witness her in flight, even in imagination, is to understand why this legend has persisted with such intensity, why communities developed elaborate protections, and why the very mention of her name could still silence conversations and draw protective gestures from those who remember the old ways. Begin with the head itself, because that is where consciousness resides, where the human face that might once have been beautiful or ordinary now becomes the focal point of supernatural dread. The face retains its human features, which is part of what makes the Penanggalan so disturbing. She's not transformed into something wholly alien or abstract. Her eyes still see with human intelligence. Her mouth still forms expressions that might be recognized as hunger, or determination, or even anguish. This persistence of humanity within the monstrous form creates a psychological tension, because observers can recognize what she was, even as they recoil from what she has become. The face might even be familiar, might belong to someone known in the community, which adds layers of betrayal and horror to any encounter. But it is what lies beneath the severed line, where the head floats impossibly without shoulders or torso, that defines the Penanggalan's unique horror. The folklore describes trailing elements that hang below, creating a silhouette unlike any natural creature. These are not mere shadows or abstract darkness, but the essential internal connections that sustain life, normally hidden within the protective shell of the body, but now exposed and visible. Traditional accounts speak of these trailing forms as resembling long roots or tendrils, swaying and moving with the motion of flight, creating a disturbing rhythm as the Penanggalan navigates through the night air. The exact appearance varies slightly in different tellings, but all agree on the fundamental wrongness of seeing what should remain concealed, what belongs inside brought out into visibility. The color and texture described in the legends contribute significantly to the visceral response the creature provokes. There is mention of a peculiar sheen or glistening quality, suggesting moisture that catches what little light penetrates the darkness. This detail serves multiple purposes in the folklore. It emphasizes the freshness of the separation, the recent emergence from the body rather than something dried or preserved. It also creates visual contrast against the night sky, making the Penanggalan visible to potential victims or witnesses as a shape that reflects moonlight or starlight in ways that natural shadows do not. This luminous quality, combined with the faint glow sometimes attributed to the head itself, transforms the Penanggalan into a thing that can be seen, but perhaps too late for those who spot her. The length of these trailing elements is significant in the practical folklore surrounding protection against the Penanggalan. They hang low enough to create vulnerability, to provide something that can be caught or snagged by defensive measures. This is not a creature that flies high above human habitation like a bird or spirit might. Instead, she moves at a level that brings her close to windows, that requires her to navigate between buildings and trees, that puts her within range of the thorny barriers and sharp implements that communities would deploy as defense. The trailing form becomes both her means of supernatural existence and her greatest weakness, the aspect of her anatomy that others can exploit to trap or destroy her. Consider the biomechanical impossibility of what the Penanggalan represents. A human head, even one animated by magic, should not be able to achieve flight. It has no wings, no obvious means of propulsion, no aerodynamic structure that would allow it to move through air with purpose and control. Yet the folklore describes her flight as deliberate and directed, not the random drifting of something caught in wind currents. She chooses her path, adjusts her altitude, navigates around obstacles with intelligence and intent. This suggests that the magic animating her provides not just the separation, but also complete control over her movements, turning what should be an inert object into something that defies gravity and natural law. The trailing elements serve a function beyond mere horror. In the logic of the curse, they represent the life force that has been extracted from the dormant body, the essential essence that must remain connected to the consciousness in order for the Penanggalan to hunt and feed. They are not decorative or incidental, but integral to her supernatural existence. When she flies, they move with a life of their own, responding to air currents and her movements in ways that suggest that they retain some sensitivity or awareness. This creates the impression of a creature that is alive in every part, not just the head, but the entire trailing form, all of it animated by the same dark magic that enabled the separation. The visual impact of the Penanggalan has inspired artistic representations across centuries, from traditional Malaysian art to contemporary interpretations. Artists have struggled with how to depict something so fundamentally disturbing, while still making it comprehensible to viewers. The most effective representations capture the silhouette, the outline against a dark sky or pale moon, emphasizing the wrongness of the proportions and the unnatural configuration. These images work on the imagination precisely because they suggest, rather than fully reveal, allowing the mind to fill in details that become more personal and therefore more frightening than any explicit rendering could achieve. The sound associated with the Penanggalan's movement adds another dimension to the sensory horror. Traditional accounts speak of a wet, sliding noise, the sound of movement that should not be possible. Some versions describe a faint humming or buzzing, perhaps the magic itself creating vibrations in the air. Others mention the rustle of the trailing elements dragging against surfaces, catching on leaves or brushing against walls. These auditory details are crucial because they provide warning, a chance for those indoors to recognize danger approaching. The sound becomes part of the terror, because hearing it means the Penanggalan is close, searching, perhaps already aware of potential prey within. The size of the Penanggalan is typically described as that of a normal human head, which makes her both recognizable and accessible as a threat. She is not gigantic like some legendary monsters, requiring vast spaces to move. Instead, she can slip through partially opened windows, can hover at ground level to peer beneath doors, can navigate the narrow spaces between houses. This human scale makes her feel more immediate and present as a danger, something that could truly infiltrate a home, rather than an abstract threat that exists only in wilderness or imagination. The ordinariness of her proportions contrasts sharply with the extraordinariness of her form, creating cognitive dissonance that intensifies the fear response. The Penanggalan's appearance also carries symbolic weight beyond the literal horror. The exposed internal elements represent secrets revealed, the hidden made visible, the private made public. In cultures that place high value on propriety and concealment of bodily functions, the Penanggalan's form is a violation of social as well as biological norms. She is obscene in the original sense of the word, displaying what should remain offstage, what polite society agrees not to acknowledge. This symbolic dimension adds layers of meaning to the legend, making her not just a physical threat, but a representation of transgression itself, of boundaries crossed and taboos violated. Understand that describing the Penanggalan requires walking a delicate line between conveying genuine horror and avoiding gratuitous detail. The power of the legend lies not in clinical description, but in the overall impression, the sense of wrongness that her existence creates. She's a creature that should not be, whose very existence violates natural law, and that violation is what makes her memorable and terrifying. The image of a flying head with trailing form has proven remarkably durable, precisely because it's specific enough to visualize yet strange enough to haunt the imagination long after the telling is finished. The separation is complete, the transformation achieved, and now the Penanggalan rises into the tropical night, with purpose burning in her consciousness. This is not aimless wandering or random movement through darkness. The hunt is methodical, driven by supernatural hunger and guided by instincts that blend her remaining human intelligence with the predatory awareness that comes with her cursed form. To understand how the Penanggalan operates, how she selects targets and navigates her territory, is to understand why entire communities lived in fear once the sun set, and why defensive measures became not optional precautions, but essential acts of survival. She is a hunter who knows her prey intimately, who understands vulnerability and exploits it with ruthless efficiency. The flight itself is unlike any natural creature's movement through air. There is no flapping of wings, no visible effort or strain. Instead, the Penanggalan glides with an eerie smoothness, rising and falling with subtle shifts in altitude that suggest complete mastery of her supernatural locomotion. She moves at varying heights depending on her purpose and the terrain below. When searching for prey, she might fly just above the tree line or rooftops, high enough to survey a wide area, but low enough to detect signs of potential victims. When approaching a specific target, she descends, sometimes coming within arm's reach of the ground, her trailing form swaying beneath her as she navigates between obstacles with precision that speaks to years of practice. The Penanggalan's senses, in her separated state, are heightened beyond normal human capability, attuned specifically to finding what she needs. Traditional accounts describe her ability to detect the scent of blood from remarkable distances, particularly the specific type of blood that satisfies her hunger. This is not merely the smell of any injury or wound, but something more particular, a signature that only certain victims carry. Her eyes, too, function differently in this form, able to pierce shadows that would blind ordinary vision, to see through gaps in walls or between window slats, to identify movement and warmth that indicate life within supposedly secure homes. These enhanced perceptions make her a formidable predator, difficult to hide from and nearly impossible to deceive. She follows patterns in her hunting, establishing a territory that she returns to night after night. This territory might encompass several villages or a broader area of countryside, covering ground that would take hours to traverse on foot, but which she can survey in a fraction of that time through flight. The Penanggalan learns her domain intimately, knows which houses are occupied by potential prey, which paths villagers take after dark, which areas offer concealment when she needs to rest or observe without being seen. This territorial behavior means that communities affected by a Penanggalan face a persistent threat rather than a random one. She will return again and again until driven away or destroyed. The identification of suitable victims is where the Penanggalan's hunting becomes most specific and most revealing of the legend's deeper cultural meanings. She does not simply attack anyone she encounters, nor does she prefer victims based on characteristics like age or strength that might matter to a natural predator. Instead, her hunger is focused on a very particular type of target, one that represents life in its most vulnerable and protected state. This specificity is not arbitrary but tied to the of her curse, to the kind of sustenance that the failed ritual demands she seek. The Penanggalan circles homes where these particular conditions exist, using her enhanced senses to confirm the presence of what she seeks before attempting to gain entry. Once a target is identified, the Penanggalan must find a way inside. Traditional Malaysian homes, particularly in rural areas, are not sealed fortresses, but structures built for ventilation in a hot climate, with openings and gaps that allow air circulation. The Penanggalan exploits these architectural features, searching for windows left partially open, gaps between wall panels, spaces beneath doors or in thatched roofs. Her lack of a body becomes an advantage here, allowing her to slip through openings that would never admit a full human form. She approaches silently, her supernatural enabling movement without the footsteps or rustling that might alert those within. The only warning might be a faint glow glimpsed through a crack, a wet sound of movement, or the instinctive fear that sometimes precedes supernatural presence. The act of entering a home, of crossing the threshold from outside to inside, carries symbolic weight in the folklore. The home is sacred space, protected by social and spiritual boundaries that ordinary dangers should not be able to breach. The Penanggalan's ability to violate this sanctuary represents a fundamental threat to the security that communities depend upon. No lock can stop her, no door bar her passage if she can find even the smallest gap. This invasive capability transforms every home from a place of safety into a potential trap, creating an atmosphere of perpetual vulnerability that affects entire villages. Sleep becomes dangerous, privacy becomes impossible, and the night itself becomes a time when protection cannot be guaranteed. Inside the target dwelling, the Penanggalan moves with careful deliberation. She is aware that noise or sudden movement might wake the occupants, might create alarm that would both deny her the opportunity to feed and potentially expose her identity if she is recognized. The folklore suggests that she can induce a deeper sleep in those nearby, using some aspect of her supernatural to ensure that her presence goes undetected. Others must remain unaware while she focuses on her specific target, approaching with a combination of stealth and predatory focus that makes her all but unstoppable once she has gained entry. The hunt, which began with her separation from her body, now reaches its critical phase. The Penanggalan's hunting patterns are not random throughout the lunar cycle or seasons, but may intensify during certain periods. Traditional knowledge suggests she is more active and desperate in her hunger during times of the new moon when darkness is most complete, or during particular festivals when community vigilance might be lowered by celebration and distraction. These patterns allowed communities to identify high-risk periods, times when extra precautions were essential, and when pregnant women and newborns might be moved to more protected locations or surrounded by additional guardians. The predictability of the Penanggalan's heightened activity provided some small advantage to those seeking to defend against her. The duration of each hunt varies depending on success and opportunity. The Penanggalan might achieve her goal quickly if she finds an unprotected target, or she might spend hours searching through her territory, moving from house to house, testing defenses, and looking for the slightest weakness to exploit. She is patient in a way that speaks to her no longer being entirely human, willing to wait and observe rather than acting rashly. Yet she is also constrained by time, always aware that dawn approaches and that she must complete her hunt and return to her hidden body before sunrise. This creates a natural limit to her hunting each night, a window of vulnerability that those who understood her could potentially exploit. As the Penanggalan hunts, she leaves traces of her passage that the observant might detect. There might be a faint trail of moisture where her form passed, disturbed objects that were moved aside to allow her entry, or a lingering scent that those with experience of her presence learn to recognize. Animals, too, react to her approach with behavior that deviates from normal patterns. Dogs might whine and hide rather than barking at an intruder. Chickens might fall silent in their coops. Even insects might cease their nightly chorus when the Penanggalan passes overhead. These signs became part of the folklore surrounding her, warnings that allowed some to take precautions before she arrived at their doorsteps. The hunt defines the Penanggalan's nocturnal existence, transforming her from a cursed woman hiding her into an active predator stalking through darkness. Each night she rises and flies, driven by hunger that will not be denied, following patterns established through repetition and refined through experience. She is both utterly alien in her methods and disturbingly purposeful in her actions, a creature that combines supernatural ability with cunning intelligence. To be in her territory, to be the type of victim she seeks, is to live with the knowledge that protection is uncertain and that the night brings danger that cannot be reasoned with or escaped through ordinary means. The hunt begins at nightfall and continues until she feeds, or until dawn forces her to abandon her search and return to her waiting body, where she will resume human form and wait for darkness to fall again. Now we must confront the most disturbing aspect of the Penanggalan legend, the specific of her hunger and the victims she seeks with relentless determination. This is where the folklore transcends simple horror and becomes a window into the deepest anxieties of traditional Southeast Asian societies, revealing fears that are both supernatural and devastatingly real. The Penanggalan does not hunt indiscriminately, does not attack the strong or the prepared, does not seek victims who might fight back or escape. Instead, her hunger is focused with terrible specificity on those who represent life at its most fragile and most sacred moment, on vulnerability that cannot defend itself, and innocence that has no understanding of the danger it faces. The primary targets of the Penanggalan are women in childbirth and newborn infants, particularly in the critical days immediately following birth. This preference is not random or convenient, but intrinsic to the of her curse, tied to the type of sustenance that her supernatural existence demands. Traditional accounts describe her drawn to the scent of blood associated with childbirth, able to detect this particular signature from distances that would be impossible for natural senses. She circles homes where labor is occurring, or where a birth has recently taken place, her hunger intensifying as she recognizes the presence of what she seeks. This focused predation transforms the act of bringing new life into the world from a moment of joy and hope into a time of maximum danger and vulnerability. To understand why this specific targeting is so culturally significant, you must recognize that childbirth in traditional societies was already fraught with genuine mortal danger. Before modern medicine, before hospitals and trained physicians, giving birth was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Maternal mortality rates were high, infant deaths were tragically common, and complications that are now easily treated could prove fatal within hours. Communities understood that the transition from pregnancy to motherhood was a liminal period, a time when both mother and child existed in a state between life and death, when the slightest complication could tip the balance toward tragedy. The Penanggalan legend takes this existing fear and gives it supernatural form, transforming abstract danger into a concrete predator with intention and agency. The hunger that drives the Penanggalan toward these victims is described in the folklore as insatiable and specific. She requires the essence of new life, something that only exists in this narrow window of time when birth has just occurred, but the child has not yet fully entered the world as an independent being. The mother, too, is vulnerable during this period, weakened by labor, her body in a state of transition and recovery that makes her particularly susceptible to supernatural attack. The Penanggalan understands this vulnerability with predatory precision, timing her approach for moments when resistance is impossible and protection is most difficult to maintain. She knows that new mothers cannot flee, that newborns cannot cry out in warning, that the very act of giving birth creates conditions ideal for her hunting. The cultural impact of this targeting pattern cannot be overstated. In communities where belief in the Penanggalan was strong, childbirth became an event that required not just physical preparation, but spiritual and magical protection. Pregnant women approaching their delivery time would be surrounded by defensive measures designed specifically to ward off the Penanggalan. Experienced midwives carried knowledge of these protections as part of their essential expertise, understanding that their role included not just assisting with the physical birth, but defending mother and child from supernatural threats. The period following birth, traditionally 40 days in many Southeast Asian cultures, was recognized as a time when special vigilance was required and when the new mother should not be left alone, particularly after sunset. This preference for victims in childbirth also reveals deeper symbolic dimensions of the Penanggalan legend. She is a figure of feminine power, twisted into its most destructive form. A woman who sought to transcend natural limitations through magic, and instead became trapped in a state that makes her the enemy of other women at their most sacred moment. There is tragic irony in a female creature preying upon mothers and infants, suggesting themes of jealousy, of corrupted fertility, of power that has become so divorced from natural cycles that it can only sustain itself by destroying what should be most precious and protected. The Penanggalan cannot create life, cannot participate in the normal human experience of motherhood, and so she feeds upon those who can, taking from them what she can never possess herself. The newborn infant represents everything the Penanggalan has lost: innocence and potential, new life untainted by the darkness she embodies, a future not yet determined by past mistakes. Her hunger for infant victims speaks to a deeper consumption than mere physical sustenance. In feeding upon the newly born, she is attempting to consume possibility itself, to take into herself some essence of the fresh start she can never have. This adds psychological complexity to the legend, transforming the Penanggalan from a simple monster into a tragic figure whose attacks on innocence represent her own permanent exile from innocence, whose predation on new life reflects her inability to ever return to the state of being alive in the normal sense. The timing of the Penanggalan's attacks is also significant in understanding the cultural context. She strikes most often during the night, when families are sleeping and when the new mother is at her most exhausted and vulnerable. The first few nights after birth are particularly dangerous, when the mother is still recovering from labor and the infant is still adjusting to existence outside the womb. Traditional practices evolved around maintaining constant watchfulness during these critical nights, with family members taking shifts to ensure that mother and child were never unguarded. These vigils served practical purposes related to postnatal care, but also functioned as defense against supernatural predation, creating a human barrier that the Penanggalan would be reluctant to challenge. The legend also addresses what happens when the Penanggalan succeeds in reaching her victims, though the folklore tends to be circumspect about explicit details, focusing instead on the aftermath and the signs that indicate her attack occurred. Mothers who survive her visitation are described as weakened and drained, unable to explain what transpired except through vague impressions of fear and the sensation of presence in the room. Infants who fall victim may sicken rapidly or fail to thrive, despite all attempts at care. These descriptions align disturbingly well with real medical conditions that traditional societies could not explain or treat. Situations where seemingly healthy babies suddenly declined, or when new mothers developed complications that physicians could not diagnose. The Penanggalan legend provided an explanation for these tragedies, a supernatural cause for suffering that otherwise seemed random and meaningless. The specificity of the Penanggalan's victims also made her a useful tool for social control and the enforcement of traditional practices around childbirth. Women who failed to observe proper postpartum protocols, who did not follow traditional restrictions, or who ventured out too soon after giving birth, risked being labelled as vulnerable to the Penanggalan, or even suspected of being one themselves. The legend reinforced behavioural expectations around modesty, seclusion during the postnatal period, and adherence to customs designed to protect both mother and child. In this way, supernatural fear served to maintain social cohesion and ensure that proven protective practices were followed even by those who might be tempted to dismiss them as superstition. The targeting of the most vulnerable also speaks to universal human fears that transcend cultural boundaries. Every society worries about the safety of newborns and new mothers, recognizes childbirth as a time of special danger, and develops practices meant to protect both. The Penanggalan legend is Malaysia's particular expression of these universal concerns, giving concrete form to anxieties that exist wherever humans bring children into the world. The image of a predator specifically seeking out the defenseless taps into primal protective instincts, creating emotional resonance that helps explain why this legend has remained so powerful across centuries. Parents everywhere can understand the fear that something might harm their child, that protection might fail at the moment it is most needed. Understanding the Penanggalan's hunger and her choice of victims transforms her from an abstract monster into a symbol of everything that can go wrong during one of life's most important transitions. She represents the fears that haunt every birth, the awareness that joy and tragedy exist in close proximity, that the moment of greatest hope is also a moment of profound vulnerability. By giving these fears a name and a form, the legend allows communities to confront them, to develop strategies for defense, to transform paralyzing anxiety into purposeful action. The Penanggalan becomes something that can be understood, predicted, and potentially defeated, making her paradoxically less terrifying than the nameless dread that might otherwise overwhelm expectant families in a world where childbirth carried genuine mortal risk. In the face of supernatural predation, communities do not simply surrender to fear and helplessness. Human ingenuity, born from desperation and refined through generations of experience, develops countermeasures even against threats that seem insurmountable. The defenses against the Penanggalan are particularly fascinating because they demonstrate profound understanding of her, turning her own supernatural characteristics into vulnerabilities that ordinary people can exploit. These protections are not the elaborate rituals or expensive talismans that only the wealthy could afford, but practical measures accessible to even the poorest families. They represent the weapons of the weak, the tools that allow those without magical power or physical strength to defend themselves and their loved ones against a predator who should be unstoppable. The most iconic and effective defense against the Penanggalan involves thorny plants, specifically varieties with long, sharp spines that can catch and entangle. Traditional Malaysian homes, particularly in rural areas where belief in the Penanggalan was strongest, incorporated these plants into their defensive architecture. The most commonly used species was a type of thorny bamboo or spiny palm, plants that grew readily in the tropical climate and required minimal maintenance once established. These were not merely planted near the home as decorative landscaping, but were positioned with deliberate strategic intent, creating barriers at the most vulnerable points of entry. The thorns served a simple but devastatingly effective purpose. They would catch and snag the Penanggalan's trailing form as she attempted to enter through windows or gaps in walls. Understand the brutal elegance of this defense. The Penanggalan's greatest asset, the trailing elements that allow her to exist in her separated state, become her greatest weakness when confronted with thorns, As she tries to slip through a window protected by thorny branches, the spines catch on her exposed form, hooking into the delicate tissue that hangs beneath her floating head. The pain would be immediate and intense, perhaps similar to what a living person would feel if internal organs were suddenly pierced by sharp objects. More critically, once caught, the Penanggalan cannot simply pull free without causing further damage. She must either retreat, abandoning her attempt to enter the home, or risk tearing herself apart in an effort to force passage. Either option represents failure of her hunt and potential exposure of her. The placement of these thorny defenses followed specific traditional patterns that reveal sophisticated understanding of the Penanggalan's behavior and capabilities. Windows were the primary focus, particularly windows of rooms where vulnerable occupants slept, or where births might occur. Bundles of thorny branches would be arranged along windowsills, creating a barrier that extended both inside and outside the opening. The thorns needed to be fresh and sharp, not dried or brittle, because only living spines retained the necessary rigidity to effectively pierce and hold. Families would regularly inspect and replace these protective barriers, treating the maintenance of thorn defenses as seriously as they treated the maintenance of door locks or roof repairs. During periods of heightened danger, such as when a woman in the household was near her delivery date, additional thorny branches might be added, creating layered defenses that would be nearly impossible for the Penanggalan to navigate. Doorways received similar treatment, though the approach was slightly different due to the need for these openings to remain functional for human use during the day. Thorny branches might be hung above doors or arranged along the threshold, positioned to catch anything attempting to slip through the gap beneath the door or through the space between door and frame. Some households maintained movable thorn barriers that could be quickly positioned at night and removed during day, allowing normal passage while still providing protection during the hours when the Penanggalan hunted. The inconvenience of managing these defenses was considered a small price to pay for the security they provided, and communities developed efficient systems for deploying and maintaining them. Roof spaces and ventilation openings, necessary in the tropical heat, presented particular challenges because they could not be completely sealed without making the home uninhabitable. Traditional solutions involved weaving thorny vines or branches into the thatching material itself, or creating screens from bamboo strips interlaced with sharp spines. These barriers allowed air circulation while preventing entry by anything larger than insects. The Penanggalan might be able to see through such barriers, might even attempt to push through, but the density of thorns made actual passage impossible without sustaining injuries that would drive her away. Clever design ensured that the more forcefully she tried to penetrate these defenses, the more thoroughly she would become entangled. Beyond physical barriers of thorns, communities employed architectural modifications specifically designed to counter the Penanggalan's abilities. Homes might be built with fewer large openings, with windows that could be shuttered completely at night, with doors that fit tightly in their frames, leaving minimal gaps. The design philosophy was simple: reduce the number of potential entry points and make those that remained as defensible as possible. This practical architecture served multiple purposes, providing protection from natural threats like animals and weather, while also defending against supernatural predation. The overlap between mundane and magical protection meant that defensive measures did not appear unusual or superstitious, but were simply regarded as sensible building practices. Some families took additional precautions by surrounding their entire property with thorny hedges, creating a perimeter defense that would deter the Penanggalan from even approaching close enough to attempt entry into the home itself. These living fences required years to establish, but provided long-term protection that could benefit multiple generations. The maintenance of such barriers became a community effort, with neighbours helping to trim and train the growth to ensure maximum density of thorns at the height where the Penanggalan typically flew. In villages where multiple families implemented these measures, the cumulative effect was a landscape transformed into a hostile environment for supernatural predators, turning the entire community into a defended space. The use of iron and metal objects as additional protection was common in areas where such materials were available. Iron had long been recognized across many cultures as having power against supernatural entities, and the Penanggalan was no exception to this rule. Families might hang iron tools or implements near windows and doors, believing that the presence of metal would repel or weaken her. Knives were particularly favored, positioned with blades pointing outward to create a symbolic threat to anything attempting entry. While the effectiveness of iron was considered less reliable than thorns, which provided physical barriers, many households employed both methods simultaneously, creating layered defenses that addressed different aspects of the threat. Ritual purification of the home, using smoke from specific woods or herbs, was another protective measure, though one that required more specialized knowledge and materials. The smoke was believed to create an invisible barrier that the Penanggalan would find difficult to penetrate, similar to how certain scents deter natural predators. These fumigation rituals would be performed regularly in households with vulnerable occupants, particularly in the days leading up to and following childbirth. The smoke also served to alert neighbours that special protections were in place, encouraging community vigilance and mutual support during periods of heightened danger. Perhaps most importantly, the defensive measures against the Penanggalan were not implemented in isolation, but as part of a comprehensive community response to the threat. Villages developed collective strategies, with families taking turns maintaining watch during the most dangerous hours, sharing knowledge about effective protective techniques, and providing mutual assistance when one household faced particular risk. This communal approach transformed defense from an individual burden into a shared responsibility, strengthening social bonds while simultaneously increasing the overall effectiveness of protective measures. A village where every home employed thorny barriers, where neighbours watched out for each other, where traditional defensive knowledge was preserved and taught to each new generation, was a village where the Penanggalan found hunting difficult and dangerous. The remarkable aspect of these traditional defenses is their endurance in modified forms, even into modern times. In rural areas of Malaysia and surrounding regions where folk beliefs remain strong, you can still observe homes with thorny plants positioned near windows. Families that maintain traditional protective practices around childbirth, and communities that preserve the old knowledge of how to defend against supernatural threats. The specific belief in the Penanggalan may have diminished with education and urbanization, but the underlying wisdom, the understanding that protection requires vigilance and practical action, remains valuable. The thorns that once guarded against flying heads now serve as general security measures, but their presence continues to reflect a cultural memory of when such defenses were matters of life and death, when the weak needed weapons against predators that should have been unstoppable. Every curse has its conditions, its requirements that must be met for the afflicted to continue existing in their unnatural state. The Penanggalan is no exception, and the most bizarre and revealing aspect of her legend involves a substance so ordinary, so mundane, that its inclusion in supernatural folklore seems almost absurd. Yet this detail, the absolute necessity of vinegar for her survival, transforms the legend from simple horror into something more complex and psychologically disturbing. It adds vulnerability to invincibility, introduces an element of desperate routine into what might otherwise be pure predation, and creates a bridge between the magical and the material that makes the entire legend feel more grounded, more believable, more real in its implications. The vinegar requirement is tied directly to the Penanggalan's nightly separation. When her head detaches and flies away to hunt, the trailing form that hangs beneath her is exposed to air, to movement, to conditions that no internal structure should ever experience. This exposure causes the delicate tissues to expand, to swell with the fluids that normally circulate through closed systems, but which now move freely in response to motion and gravity. Throughout the night, as the Penanggalan flies and feeds, this expansion continues, gradually increasing the overall size and length of her trailing form. By the time dawn approaches and she must return to her hidden body, the trailing elements have grown too large to fit back into the cavity from which they emerged. Without intervention, reunion would be impossible, and the Penanggalan would be trapped in her separated state, exposed and vulnerable when daylight comes. This is where vinegar becomes essential. Serving a purpose that is both practical and deeply symbolic, the Penanggalan must locate a vessel large enough to contain her expanded form, typically the same vat or barrel that was involved in her original failed transformation. She fills this container with vinegar, sometimes described as specially prepared or aged vinegar, rather than ordinary household varieties, suggesting that specific properties or concentrations are required for the process to work effectively. The act of submerging herself is not comfortable or pleasant, but necessary, a ritual that must be performed completely and correctly if she is to survive to see another night. She lowers her separated form into the acidic liquid, fully immersing the trailing elements that have swollen during her nocturnal activities. The vinegar works through a process that folklore describes with surprising attention to detail, suggesting observation, or at least careful imagination, of how such a thing might function. The acid causes the expanded tissues to contract, to shrink back toward their original size and configuration. This is not instantaneous, but requires time, perhaps half an hour or more of complete immersion, during which the Penanggalan must remain still and patient, despite the approaching dawn and the urgency of reuniting with her body before sunrise. The sensation is described in some accounts as painful, a burning or stinging that is the price she pays for her nocturnal freedom. Others suggest numbness or a strange tingling, as though the vinegar is not merely shrinking the physical form, but also affecting the supernatural connection that animates it. The requirement for this ritual creates a predictable vulnerability that those who know the Penanggalans can potentially exploit. She must have access to vinegar, must maintain a supply sufficient for nightly use, must have a secure location where she can perform the ritual without interruption or discovery. These necessities leave traces that the observant might detect. A household that consumes unusually large quantities of vinegar, a woman who shows signs of acid exposure on her skin or clothing, unexplained sounds of splashing or movement during the hours before dawn, all these could serve as clues that point toward the presence of a Penanggalan. In folklore traditions, these signs became part of the knowledge that communities used to identify suspected Penanggalan, leading to confrontations or attempts at destruction that we will explore further. The timing of the vinegar ritual is critical and creates dramatic tension in the legend. The Penanggalan must complete her hunt, must feed or at least attempt to feed, then must locate her vinegar vessel and perform the shrinking ritual, all before the first light of dawn touches the horizon. If she miscalculates, if she hunts too long, or travels too far from her prepared location, if she becomes entangled in defensive thorns and loses precious time extracting herself, she may not be able to complete the process before sunrise arrives. The consequences of this failure are catastrophic. Some versions of the legend suggest that exposure to sunlight while in her separated state would destroy her entirely, burning away the supernatural force that animates her. Others describe a more horrible fate. She would be trapped in her expanded form, unable to shrink without vinegar, unable to reunite with her body, left to exist in agony as daylight exposes her for what she is. The vinegar ritual also creates a mundane limitation on an otherwise supernatural creature, grounding her in physical reality in ways that make the legend more psychologically effective. The Penanggalan is not purely spiritual or abstract, but has material needs, chemical requirements that must be met. She cannot simply vanish or transform at will, but must follow a specific procedure that involves ordinary substances and predictable processes. This combination of magical ability and physical constraint makes her feel more real, more like something that could actually exist within the natural world despite violating every law of biology. The specific detail of vinegar, rather than some exotic or mystical substance, reinforces this sense of grounded impossibility. The origin of vinegar in the ritual connects back to her initial failed transformation, creating narrative symmetry that strengthens the overall legend. She began her journey toward becoming the Penanggalan by submerging herself in a vinegar bath as part of a magical ritual meant to grant her power. That interrupted ritual cursed her, but it also established vinegar as the substance tied to her transformation. Now, every night, she must repeat a corrupted version of that original ritual, using vinegar not to gain power, but merely to survive, to undo the expansion that her separation causes, so she can return to the illusion of normalcy. The substance that was supposed to elevate her has become her prison, a daily reminder of the ambition that destroyed her humanity. The practical aspects of maintaining a vinegar supply in a traditional village setting add another layer of vulnerability to the Penanggalan's existence. Vinegar was not unlimited or free, but had to be produced or purchased, requiring resources and creating dependencies that could potentially expose her. A woman who regularly bought large quantities of vinegar might attract attention and questions. One who produced her own would need to maintain fermentation vessels and processes that could be discovered. The logistics of secretly maintaining this supply while appearing normal to her community created constant stress and risk, making the Penanggalan's existence one of perpetual anxiety rather than pure predatory confidence. The vinegar ritual also serves as a moment of profound vulnerability each night. During the immersion, the Penanggalan is effectively helpless, unable to flee or defend herself, focused entirely on the process of contraction that will allow her to reunite with her body. If someone discovered her during this ritual, if an enemy or suspicious neighbor tracked her to her hiding place and arrived while she was submerged, she would be at their mercy. This creates a window of opportunity for those seeking to destroy her, a specific time when she cannot use her supernatural mobility or frightening appearance to escape confrontation. The knowledge of this vulnerability became part of the strategic information that communities preserved, teaching people not just what the Penanggalan was, but when and how she could be most effectively opposed. The bizarre specificity of the vinegar requirement has contributed to the Penanggalan legend's persistence and memorability. Among the many creatures of Southeast Asian folklore, few have such a distinctive and unusual weakness. The detail is striking enough to be remembered, strange enough to provoke curiosity and discussion, yet practical enough to feel plausible within the logic of the legend. It transforms the Penanggalan from a generic flying monster into a creature with specific characteristics and limitations, giving her a depth and complexity that pure horror alone could not achieve. The vinegar ritual humanizes her, even as it emphasizes her monstrosity, showing that even supernatural predators are bound by rules and requirements that govern their existence, that power always comes with price and limitation that cannot be escaped. Folklore becomes most powerful when it intersects with lived experience, when abstract legend meets personal testimony. when the stories told around fires find validation in events that defy rational explanation. The Penanggalan legend is no exception, and throughout the regions where belief in her persisted, there accumulated a body of accounts, testimonies, and supposed evidence that transformed her from mere myth into something communities treated as documented reality. These encounters, and the evidence they generated, reveal as much about human psychology and social dynamics as they do about supernatural belief, showing how fear, suspicion, and cultural expectations can shape perception and create narratives that feel utterly convincing to those who experience them. To examine these accounts is to walk the blurred line between folklore and fact, between genuine mystery and socially constructed truth. The most common form of evidence for the Penanggalan's existence came from nocturnal sightings, accounts from people who claimed to have witnessed her in flight or observed signs of her passage. These testimonies follow remarkably consistent patterns across different villages and time periods, suggesting either genuine encounters with something unexplained or the power of cultural narrative to shape how people interpret ambiguous experiences. Witnesses describe seeing a glowing form moving through darkness at unusual heights, neither bird nor bat, but something that defied easy categorization. The distinctive silhouette, a rounded shape at the top with trailing elements beneath, matched the traditional descriptions of the Penanggalan so precisely that observers felt certain they had encountered the legendary creature rather than some natural phenomenon. The emotional impact of such sightings was profound, creating fear that rippled through entire communities and prompting immediate defensive measures. More disturbing were accounts from those who claimed to have been targeted by the Penanggalan, but survived the encounter. New mothers would wake in the night with a sense of overwhelming dread, feeling a presence in the room that their rational mind could not identify, but their instincts recognized as predatory and malevolent. Some reported seeing a faint glow near windows, or hearing wet, sliding sounds that seemed to come from just outside their walls. Others described the sensation of being watched, of eyes upon them in the darkness, combined with a smell that witnesses struggled to articulate but consistently described as wrong, as something that did not belong in human spaces. Upon investigation, these families might find disturbed thorny barriers, moisture on windowsills where no rain had fallen, or other physical signs that something had attempted to gain entry. The fact that mother and child survived these nights was attributed to the effectiveness of protective measures, proof that the traditional defenses worked and that the threat was real. The identification of suspected Penanggalan within a community followed patterns that reveal the darker aspects of folklore, belief, and its potential for social harm. Certain behaviors or characteristics became markers that could draw suspicion toward a woman, transforming her into a potential supernatural predator in the eyes of her neighbors. A woman who kept unusual hours, who seemed tired or drained during daylight but showed energy after dark, might attract attention. One who purchased or produced large quantities of vinegar, particularly if she had no obvious use for such amounts, could find herself subject to whispered speculation. Women who lived alone, who practiced any form of traditional medicine or midwifery, who had conflicts with other families or showed signs of prosperity that seemed disproportionate to their visible means of earning, all these factors could contribute to suspicion. The accusation of being a Penanggalan became a weapon that could be deployed in social conflicts, a way to ostracize or punish women who violated community norms or threatened established hierarchies. The process of investigating suspected Penanggalan varied, but often involved community surveillance and the search for physical evidence. Neighbors might watch a suspected woman's home during the night, looking for signs that she left her bed and flew away. They might search for hidden vinegar vessels, for spaces where a body could be concealed during nightly separation, for any indication that supported their suspicions. The discovery of certain items, particularly large containers of vinegar, or secluded areas, within or near her home could be interpreted as confirmation of guilt. Some communities developed tests, methods supposedly capable of revealing a Penanggalan's true. These might involve forcing the suspect to handle iron objects based on the belief that contact with metal would cause her pain or reveal her supernatural. Others relied on the testimony of spiritual practitioners or shamans who claimed ability to detect supernatural entities through ritual or divination. The social implications of being accused as a Penanggalan were severe and often permanent. Even if the accusation was not proven to the satisfaction of community authorities, the stigma attached to the suspect could destroy her social standing and make her life in the village untenable. She might be shunned by former friends, excluded from community gatherings, viewed with suspicion and fear by people who once trusted her. In extreme cases, particularly in historical periods when belief in supernatural threats was most intense, accused Penanggalan faced violence. Communities might attack her home, destroy her property, drive her from the village, or, in the darkest instances, execute her as a threat to collective safety. The fact that many accused women were marginalized or vulnerable before the accusation, widows, or those without male protection, elderly women past childbearing age, or practitioners of traditional crafts that involved mysterious knowledge, reveals how folklore belief could be weaponized against those least able to defend themselves. Yet, there existed accounts that seemed to defy easy dismissal as mere superstition or social persecution. Testimonies that came from credible witnesses and involved details difficult to explain through conventional understanding. Respected community, elders, religious leaders, or colonial administrators, who might have been expected to dismiss such stories as primitive nonsense, sometimes found themselves confronting experiences that challenged their assumptions. These accounts speak of finding evidence that seemed to confirm the legend, physical traces that suggested something extraordinary had occurred. A body discovered at dawn in an unusual state, a woman found with unexplained marks or conditions that match descriptions of the Penanggalan's reunification process, locations where vinegar had been spilled, or where the chemical smell lingered without obvious source. While modern analysis might offer alternative explanations involving medical conditions, accidents, or deliberate staging, to those who witnessed such evidence within the cultural context where belief in the Penanggalan was normalized, these discoveries felt like confirmation of supernatural reality. The documentation of Penanggalan encounters intensified during periods of colonial contact, when European observers attempted to catalogue and understand local beliefs. Some colonial administrators, missionaries, or travelers recorded testimonies they encountered, preserving accounts that might otherwise have remained purely oral. These written records present fascinating contradictions, often beginning with the author's stated skepticism or dismissal of native superstition, but then describing events or testimonies that clearly troubled them, that suggested phenomena they could not easily explain within their rational frameworks. The tension in these accounts between colonial certainty about the superiority of Western and the unsettling impact of first-hand testimony from intelligent, sincere witnesses reveals the psychological power of folklore when encountered on its own cultural territory. Some European observers went so far as to acknowledge that while they could not believe in the literal existence of the Penanggalan, they could not deny that something was occurring in these communities, something that produced real fear and real behavioral responses. The line between folklore, superstition, and social control becomes most blurred when examining how Penanggalan belief functioned to regulate female behavior and maintain patriarchal authority. The legend served as a cautionary tale about women who sought power outside approved channels, who practiced forbidden knowledge, who operated in spiritual or medical realms that challenged male dominance. By portraying the consequence of such transgression as transformation into a monster that preyed upon the most vulnerable, the folklore reinforced messages about staying within prescribed social roles. Women who might have been tempted to explore traditional magic, to claim authority as healers or spiritual practitioners, to assert independence from male control, faced not just social disapproval, but the threat of being identified as supernatural predators. The Penanggalan legend thus functioned as a mechanism of social control, using supernatural fear to maintain behavioral norms and discourage deviation from established gender hierarchies. Yet to dismiss all Penanggalan accounts as purely superstitious persecution is to potentially miss something more nuanced about how communities understood and responded to real phenomena. Unexplained deaths of infants and mothers during childbirth were tragically common in traditional societies, and the Penanggalan legend provided a framework for making sense of these losses. Rather than accepting that death could be random and meaningless, that a healthy baby could simply stop breathing without cause, or that a strong woman could die from complications that no one understood, the legend offered explanation and potential prevention. If deaths were caused by the Penanggalan, then protective measures might save future victims. The folklore transformed incomprehensible tragedy into understandable threat, giving communities agency through defensive actions, even when facing dangers they could not truly control. This psychological function, providing structure and meaning in the face of chaos and loss, may explain why belief persisted so stubbornly, even in the face of modernization and education that challenged supernatural explanations. Every monster is a mirror, reflecting back to us the fears, anxieties, and unresolved tensions of the culture that created it. The Penanggalan is no exception, and to truly understand this legend, we must look beyond the surface horror to examine what deeper truths about human society and psychology this creature embodies. She is not simply a random assemblage of frightening elements designed to provoke revulsion, but a carefully constructed symbol that encodes complex cultural messages about power, gender, transgression, and vulnerability. When we hold up the Penanggalan as a mirror, what we see reflected is a society grappling with fundamental questions about female agency, the boundaries of acceptable ambition, and the dangerous, liminal spaces where life meets death, where human meets supernatural, where the civilized veneer cracks to reveal something primal and threatening beneath. Begin with the most obvious symbolic dimension, the Penanggalan, as representation of female power that has escaped patriarchal control. In traditional Southeast Asian societies, as in most historical cultures, women's roles were carefully circumscribed, their activities monitored and limited by social structures designed to maintain male dominance. Women who sought power outside approved channels, who claimed knowledge or abilities that challenged established hierarchies, who refused to remain within prescribed boundaries, represented threats to the social order. The Penanggalan legend takes this threat and literalizes it, transforming the woman who reaches for forbidden power into a creature that literally separates from normal human constraints, that flies freely through the night while men sleep, that operates outside the rules that govern ordinary existence. Her physical separation from her body becomes a metaphor for social separation from acceptable female roles. Yet the legend does not simply celebrate or romanticize this transgression, but presents it as fundamentally cursed and corrupting. The Penanggalan achieves a form of freedom and power, but at a cost that transforms her into something monstrous, something that can never return to normal human existence. This is the cautionary heart of the legend. Women who seek power beyond their prescribed roles will indeed gain something, but what they gain will destroy their humanity, will isolate them from community, will turn them into predators who threaten the very things that traditional society considers most sacred. The message is clear and brutal. Stay within your assigned boundaries, or become something no longer recognizable as human, no longer worthy of sympathy or protection. The Penanggalan serves as a warning etched in supernatural horror, a demonstration of what supposedly awaits women who dare to transgress. The aging female body is another crucial dimension of what the Penanggalan represents. In many versions of the legend, the woman who becomes the Penanggalan does so in an attempt to preserve youth and beauty, to extend her years beyond what allows, to maintain physical attractiveness and vitality as time threatens to steal them away. This reflects deep cultural anxieties about female aging, about the loss of reproductive capacity and sexual desirability that traditional societies often equated with loss of value and status. The Penanggalan becomes a grotesque parody of the attempt to remain young, achieving a form of extended existence, but in a state that is horrifying rather than beautiful, powerful but repulsive, immortal but cursed. She represents the fear that attempts to resist natural aging will backfire, creating something worse than graceful acceptance of mortality. The separated head, the exposed internal elements, the nightly ritual of vinegar immersion. All these details can be read as commentary on the futility and danger of trying to escape the natural progression of the female life cycle. The practice of magic and access to forbidden knowledge forms another layer of symbolic meaning. The Penanggalan begins as a practitioner of dark arts, someone who has chosen to pursue supernatural power through rituals and incantations that respectable society forbids. This reflects historical realities where women who practice traditional healing, midwifery, or spiritual work existed in ambiguous social positions, valued for their knowledge, but also feared and suspected for their access to realms beyond ordinary understanding. The transformation into the Penanggalan represents what happens when such practice goes too far, when the pursuit of hidden knowledge becomes obsession rather than service. The interrupted ritual that creates the curse speaks to the danger of incomplete understanding, of attempting to master forces that one does not fully comprehend. The legend warns that dabbling in supernatural matters without proper preparation or guidance will result in catastrophe, that some knowledge is forbidden for good reason. Maternal vulnerability and the dangers of childbirth provide perhaps the most emotionally resonant dimension of the Penanggalan's symbolic weight. By targeting new mothers and infants, she embodies every fear that surrounds this most critical life transition. In societies where maternal and infant mortality were devastatingly common, where every birth carried on genuine risk of death for mother or child or both, the Penanggalan gave form to these omnipresent anxieties. She is the nightmare made manifest, the danger that stalks women at their most vulnerable moment, the predator that seeks to consume new life before it can fully establish itself in the world. The fact that she is specifically female, that she targets other women and their babies, adds layers of meaning about female competition, about the complex relationships between women in patriarchal societies, about how resources and status often depended on successful reproduction. The Penanggalan can be read as the dark shadow of motherhood itself, representing all the ways that bringing life into the world can fail, all the dangers that lurk around the margins of this supposedly joyful experience. The concept of separation, of being divided between two states, carries psychological and social resonance beyond the literal horror of the Penanggalan's nightly transformation. Many women in traditional societies experience themselves as fundamentally divided, forced to present one face in public while concealing private thoughts, feelings, and desires that did not align with social expectations. The performance of appropriate femininity, the maintenance of respectability, the suppression of ambition or anger or sexuality that society deemed inappropriate, all these created a sense of living between two selves. The Penanggalan literalizes this division, making it physical and visible, showing what it might mean to truly split apart the public persona from the hidden self. That the hidden self in this case is monstrous and predatory speaks to cultural fears about what women might become if freed from social constraints, what desires and appetites they might reveal if the civilized facade were stripped away. The vulnerability that comes with the Penanggalan's separated state also carries symbolic weight. She achieves a form of power and freedom, but at the cost of creating new weaknesses, new dependencies, new ways in which she can be trapped or destroyed. The thorns catch her trailing form. The vinegar becomes a necessity she cannot escape. Her body lies helpless and exposed while she hunts. This reflects a truth about transgressive power, that breaking free from one set of constraints often creates new ones, that achieving autonomy in one area may create vulnerability in others, that there is no simple escape from the structures that bind us. The Penanggalan's curse demonstrates that power without connection to normal human life, freedom without community, immortality without love or purpose, these are hollow victories that create their own forms of imprisonment. The geographical and cultural specificity of the Penanggalan legend also matters when interpreting its symbolic dimensions. This is a creature born from Southeast Asian experience, reflecting the particular history, environment, and social structures of that region. The tropical setting, where darkness falls suddenly and completely, where dense jungle presses close to human habitation, where dangerous creatures, both natural and supernatural, are assumed to share space with ordinary life, all this creates a context where the Penanggalan feels believable and immediate, rather than abstract or foreign. The legend speaks to communities that understood vulnerability, that lived with genuine threats from disease, predators, and natural disasters, that developed intricate systems of protection and mutual support as responses to pervasive danger. The Penanggalan becomes part of this larger ecosystem of threat and defense, one more danger to guard against, in a world already full of reasons for fear. When we examine the Penanggalan as cultural mirror, we see reflected the anxieties of societies in transition, struggling to maintain traditional structures in the face of forces that threaten to dissolve them. The woman who becomes the Penanggalan represents change itself, the refusal to accept limitation, the desire for something beyond what conventional life offers. That she becomes monstrous in this pursuit reflects conservative impulses to resist change, to maintain established hierarchies, to punish those who challenge the status quo. Yet the legend persists precisely because it addresses real human desires and real human fears, because it speaks to the eternal tension between individual ambition and social stability, between the longing for transcendence and the recognition that some boundaries exist for necessary reasons. The Penanggalan is horrifying not just because of her grotesque form, but because she represents possibilities that are simultaneously attractive and terrible. Freedom that comes at costs we might not be willing to pay. Power that transforms us into something we no longer recognize as human or valuable. The Penanggalan may have been born in the darkness of traditional belief, but she has not vanished with the coming of electricity, hospitals, and modern education. Instead, she has evolved, transformed from whispered warning to cultural icon, from lurking presence in village nights to symbol of national folklore. Her story endures because it answers enduring questions. What do we fear? What do we desire? What are we capable of becoming when the boundaries of the natural world begin to unravel? To speak of the Penanggalan today is to acknowledge the persistence of imagination itself, the way that myths never truly die, but change their shape to fit each new age that that inherits them. In modern Malaysia and throughout Southeast Asia, belief in the Penanggalan still lingers at the edges of daily life, particularly in rural areas where the old ways have not completely yielded to urban modernity. There are still occasional reports, scattered across years and regions, of strange lights moving through night skies, of eerie sounds heard outside homes, of animals behaving in ways that suggest invisible presence. These sightings are no longer universally accepted as supernatural, but they retain cultural power, triggering memories of the old stories and a kind of instinctive caution. Even those who claim not to believe in such things might still avoid certain places after midnight, or hang thorny branches near windows without admitting why. The legend has become part of the landscape, a shared cultural vocabulary that expresses both disbelief and reverence toward the unseen. In cities where ancient folklore coexists with neon light and skyscrapers, the Penanggalan has undergone transformation into a figure of art, film, and popular culture. She appears in horror movies, novels, and comic books, her image adapted to contemporary sensibilities, but retaining the fundamental elements that define her. Artists reinterpret her not only as a source of fear, but as a symbol of resistance, of female power reclaimed from patriarchal punishment. Some portray her as tragic rather than evil, an outcast cursed by circumstances rather than intentions, navigating existence between two worlds. These modern depictions are not faithful retellings of the original stories, but conversations with them. Reinterpretations that ask what happens when old fears meet new identities. The resulting versions of the Penanggalan invite empathy as much as dread, asking audiences to see the human within the horror. Folklore scholars in recent decades have begun to study the Penanggalan, not as superstition to be dismissed, but as cultural artifact, deserving of preservation and interpretation. They recognize that she represents an invaluable expression of local belief, a lens through which to view historical anxieties about gender, medicine, and morality. Universities include her story in courses exploring regional mythologies, while cultural museums present exhibits dedicated to Southeast Asian supernatural traditions. In this academic context, the Penanggalan is no longer merely the monster of night, but a cultural heritage figure, a vessel for memory and meaning. What once terrified communities into vigilance now fascinates researchers seeking to understand how imagination shapes human societies. The persistence of the Penanggalan legend also testifies to a broader truth about modernity. Progress does not erase the supernatural, but gives it new forms. As explains old mysteries, new ones arise in the gaps between what we know and what we fear might still be true. The Penanggalan lives on in those gaps, occupying the shadows cast by technology itself. Ghost stories circulate online. Social media spreads rumors of sightings, and videos claim to capture footage of unexplained lights over Malaysian forests. These digital echoes may not convince skeptics, but they reveal a timeless desire to keep the strange alive, to preserve a sense that the world remains larger and more mysterious than we can measure or control. Even in an era of satellites and data, the sky remains haunted by imagination. For local communities that still maintain belief, the Penanggalan functions less as literal threat and more as moral or spiritual touchstone. She reminds people to observe traditions, to respect taboos, to honor the delicate boundaries between the human and the supernatural. Women approaching childbirth may still receive blessings and protections derived from older practices, not because families expect an airborne predator to visit, but because these rituals symbolize collective care and continuity. The legend becomes a language of protection and solidarity, a way of expressing love, and fear in the same gesture. In this sense, the Penanggalan serves the same purpose she always has, not simply to frighten, but to teach, to unify, to give shape to the invisible dangers of existence. The transformation of the Penanggalan from feared entity to cultural emblem mirrors a larger pattern in the evolution of folklore worldwide. As societies progress, they reinterpret their old myths through new lenses, turning monsters into metaphors and curses into commentary. The terror that once kept people awake at night becomes a story told for amusement or reflection, stripped of literal belief but enriched with symbolic meaning. In this way, legends achieve immortality not by remaining unchanged, but by adapting, by speaking differently to each generation that retells them. The Penanggalan's continued presence in stories, films, and art attests to the power of myth to survive every attempt to banish it. What began as a warning whispered in fear now endures as a symbol of fascination, bridging the distance between past and present. And yet, beneath all the modern reinterpretation, something older and deeper continues to pulse within the legend. The fear of isolation, of transformation, of hunger that can never be satisfied still resonates even in the most rational minds. We may no longer believe that a flying head stalks the tropical night, but we understand what it means to feel divided within oneself, to be consumed by desire or regret, to live hidden from those we love. The Penanggalan speaks to that universal human condition, the sense of being haunted not by spirits, but by the shadow of what we might become if our own boundaries slip away. Her story may have changed, but the emotions it taps remain the same across centuries. Fear, longing, guilt, hope. The global fascination with the Penanggalan has even extended beyond the region that birthed her. As audiences around the world discover Southeast Asian folklore through movies and literature, for many, she serves as a striking introduction to a different understanding of horror, less about violence and spectacle, more about taboo, morality, and the spiritual cost of breaking cosmic order. Compared to Western monsters born of Gothic decay or technological terror, the Penanggalan represents something far more intimate, the horror that comes from within, from the failure to reconcile power with responsibility, freedom with restraint. This universality makes her legend travel far, crossing cultural barriers because it speaks to something shared in every human psyche. Ultimately, the endurance of the Penanggalan demonstrates that stories of darkness persist, not because we enjoy fear, but because we need it. Fear, properly understood, is not an enemy but a teacher, reminding us of limits, urging us to caution, compelling us to stay close to one another in the face of the unknowable. The Penanggalan, in her grotesque grace, teaches that every transgression carries consequence, that power without compassion becomes hunger, and that the human spirit is strongest when it acknowledges its own fragility. Her legend endures because it contains truth clothed in terror, that we are all creatures of two worlds, torn between the physical and the spiritual, the seen and the unseen, the rational and the inexplicable. As this exploration draws to its close, one truth remains clear. The Penanggalan is not simply a monster from the past, but a living idea that continues to evolve with each telling. She is a reminder that myths do not vanish. They migrate, adapt, and whisper differently to each generation that listens. The night still belongs to storytellers, to those who keep alive the delicate thread connecting modern minds to ancient fears. If these tales endure, it is because they speak to something essential, something that cannot quantify, but the human heart remembers. And so, if you have journeyed with us through these shadows, consider carrying a fragment of the old world with you. Let it remind you that wonder and fear are siblings, and that every story of darkness is also, in its way, a story of survival. If her legend has haunted you tonight, then the Penanggalan has done what every true myth must do, reflected our shared humanity through the mirror of fear. Before you go, take a moment to subscribe to Echoes of the Old World and join this growing community of seekers, dreamers, and storytellers who believe that the past still speaks. Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of the Penanggalan's story moved you most, and what lessons do you take from her lingering presence? The voices of those who listen keep these old stories alive, ensuring that even in a world of light, the shadows will never be entirely forgotten.